It's a real joy for me to be here, particularly because I have never before had the opportunity to speak with a secular humanistic Jewish congregation. And so thank you to the members of Mahar for having me. And it enables me to explore an element of the history of ethical humanism, which is the tradition I represent at the Ethical Society of St. Louis, which we very rarely speak about within our own community. So I'm very, very grateful to you for inviting me to speak with you today. I'm going to start with a story. The year is 1873, and the 22-year-old philosopher Felix Adler has just returned from his studies in Germany to give his first sermon at his father's temple, Temple Emmanuel in New York. Adler was expected to succeed his father as rabbi, and he'd been sent to Germany to study religion. When he got there, though, like many young people, he sidestepped his parents' wishes and studied philosophy instead, becoming enamored with neo-Kantian and transcendentalist thinkers. When he arose to speak at Temple Emmanuel, the anticipation must have been great. This was the first address of a prodigal son returned, they thought, to the flock. Adler's skill as an orator, a skill which would soon see him draw overflowing crowds to hear him speak at Carnegie Hall and see his addresses printed in the New York Times, must have been on clear display.
Please support the freedom from
What would this short, slight young man with receding hair and a high forehead say? His heart fired with the spiritual energy of Emerson, his head swimming with the ideas of Immanuel Kant. He called his sermon "The Judaism of the Future." And in it, he outlined a radical new departure for Judaism, which centered on universal human ethics and right relations between people, rather than on the rituals, symbols, and ethnic identity of traditional Judaism. And to cap it all off, he did not once mention God. Adler was not given the position as his father's replacement. Indeed, he was never invited to speak at his father's temple again. But that moment, that turning point in Adler's life, led him to found something new: ethical culture, the tradition I represent as clergy for the Ethical Society of St. Louis, and which Amanda represents as clergy for the Washington Ethical Society, at least for another month or so. What did Adler say in his address which so shocked the congregation that they never invited him back? Well, lucky for you, for all of us, I suppose, the recently retired leader emeritus of the New York Society for Ethical Culture was recently clearing out her office in September of last year, in fact, and came upon a copy of that very address delivered at the Temple Emmanuel in 11th October 1873. It began: "A tranquil summer's eve was closing in upon Jerusalem as Rabbi Yosef dragged his way wearily through the desolate streets of Zion toward the hill of the temple. Fallen stones and mouldering masses blocked the path. The houses were empty, and wolves and jackals howled in the halls where once no sound was heard save the measured tread of the silent priest or the loud swelling of Levitic choirs." Throughout his address, Adler weaves a story epic in its scope, ranging from that desolate Sepphoris where Yosef built a school amongst the ruins, to the time of the Jewish Enlightenment of the 18th and 19th centuries, to stories from classical antiquity, to fairy tales. Adler had a philosopher's mind, a storyteller's heart, and a vast range of interests. And all three were on display at Temple Emmanuel that morning. Yet there are a number of key argumentative threads in Adler's address in which I think we can see the genesis of what would soon become ethical culture. And I thought it would be interesting to use that first and last address that Adler gave at Temple Emmanuel as a way of understanding how he was thinking and following some of the threads of ethical humanism as it is today back to their Jewish roots. And so that's what I'm going to do for you this morning. First, it's very clear in Adler's conception of the history of Judaism, which he presents in that address, that he views it as an evolving tradition, not one defined by specific rites and religious practices, but by the call to a higher way of living. He relates a series of stages in Jewish history, and in each stage, whether it's Rabbi Yosef in Sepphoris or Mendelssohn during the Jewish Enlightenment or the leaders of the Reform movement of his own day, it's clear that Adler identifies not with those who wanted to cling to the rituals of the past, but those who sought progress and rejuvenation through change. Adler sees change as a chance to throw off stifling religious shackles and rededicate Judaism to what he sees as its central work, promoting ethical behavior. In this, he's very much showing the influence of his father Samuel, who was, of course, a leading figure in Reform Judaism. And Adler's description of the first Reformed Jews is almost heroic in character. He said that day, "There arose in Germany a body of earnest workers, men of iron mold and souls of dauntless daring, the vanguard of reform. They came with the hammer of argument and the pickaxe of criticism to tear down the tottering columns. Ceremony after ceremony was abolished, custom after custom declared obsolete. No feelings of misplaced reverence for the relics of a hoary past could deter them, for they knew that there was danger to the living in such false love of the dead, that evil spirits haunt the ruins, superstition, fanaticism, and all things noxious that shun the light." Sometimes reading Adler is a bit like reading Tolkien. So vivid is his imagery and so forceful his metaphors. And you can see from that passage that Adler clearly revered the work that this vanguard of reform had done to, in his mind, clear away the superstitious ritual rubble of Judaism, cutting away the dead flesh so that the religion might live anew. So, one central component of Adler's thinking, he tends to think that the specific practices of a religious faith can stifle its ethical soul, and he supports efforts to release that soul from its institutional and intellectual shackles. He is at heart a religious reformer in both the Jewish and the general sense of the word. Yet Adler is not satisfied with piecemeal reform, reform which stops at some arbitrary point saying this is far enough. He wants to take reform to what he sees as its logical limit, to its ultimate. Adler sees the reform movement in Judaism as part of a process, not as a destination in itself. And so he naturally asks in his address, what now? What's next? His answer was pretty ominous, for Adler believed that while the reform movement had done great work clearing away the old, they had failed thus far to replace what they had torn down with anything compelling and new. He looked at the religious landscape of his time, with more people turning away from religion than ever, and many religious leaders held in great distrust by the people, and saw great peril for Judaism, perhaps even the end of the religion and religion in general itself. And he wanted to go right back to the roots of religion, to strip absolutely everything non-essential away and build something new focused purely on those roots. What he understood those roots to be, we'll get to in a moment. But for now, the important point to understand is that Adler wasn't just a reformer, he was a radical. He wanted to get back to the root of things, which is what the word radical means. And he wasn't concerned much with the dead ground he'd have to dig up to get there. He wanted to go further than the Reformed Jews of his time had gone, get closer to what he viewed as the heart of Judaism and the heart of all religion. What was for Adler the heart of religion, the root that had to be recovered? It was ethical idealism, those values which are best in people. At the heart of Adler's religious conception and his understanding of Judaism as a religion was the idea that religion is fundamentally about uplifting the best in the human spirit. And Adler, unlike really any Jewish intellectuals of his time, was willing to chuck out absolutely everything about Judaism which wasn't about that. Of course, he didn't see this as doing any injustice to the Jewish tradition. At this point, when he was making this address, he still understood himself to be Jewish and to be a Jewish thinker. It was just that for him, the specific scriptures, creedal beliefs, and religious practices of contemporary Judaism were the extraneous parts of the tradition. The character of the Jewish people, the values they had displayed across generations, was the central thing, not their beliefs. And I'll say more about that in a second. But it's worth noting that one of the most dramatic elements of Adler's address was that one of the things that he clearly considered extraneous to Judaism was God. Now, I mentioned earlier that the members of Temple Emmanuel were shocked not to hear Adler mention God at all in his address. And it's true, you can go through the entire thing and there isn't a single mention of the divine. But this rather underplays how deeply humanistic, in a broad sense, his presentation was that day. The story of Judaism which Adler presents is entirely focused on its natural history, on the Jewish people themselves. He makes moving reference to the historic oppression of the Jews, being driven from land to land, being treated as pariahs, and dwells on the spirit of a people who can endure so many generations of hardship. Yet he talks not a bit about any God which has a special covenant with them. Rather than uplifting them for any special relationship with the divine, Adler exalts Jews for their moral character. When exhorting his audience to remember the power of the Jewish tradition, he points not to scripture, but to their shared cultural history, both distant and more recent. In one stirring passage, for instance, he asks the congregants to remember what they had all achieved as a community since coming to America. He says, if you doubt your strength, look around you. A few decades have passed since you came to the shores of this new land, homeless, friendless, shelterless. And now, what a commanding position have you built for yourselves? Adler sees the strength of the Jewish tradition, indeed the very identity of Judaism, in the character of the Jewish people and their shared history, not in their particular religious beliefs. It is their steadfastness, their industriousness, their compassion, their dedication to community and family, which defines for him their Jewishness. And that identification of Jewishness with Jewish values, rather than with any particular doctrines, practices, or beliefs of the Jewish faith, which allows Adler to make his most surprising and possibly for his audience most troubling move. He expands the notion of Judaism such that it encompasses all people who share those same values. At more than one point in his address, he makes this explicit, saying, "Listen to the clear metallic notes that ring from the pulpits of the free religionists here and elsewhere. Do you not hear the great humanitarian doctrines of Judaism re-echo in their words? Are not they too the children of the prophets, our brothers?" He goes on to say, "We discard the narrow spirit of exclusion and loudly proclaim that Judaism was not given to the Jews alone, but that its destiny is to embrace in one great moral state the whole family of man." So Adler has made his case. The Judaism of the future, in his mind, would be one focused not on the doctrines, rituals, or even ethnic identity of traditional Judaism, but on ethical values demonstrated through right action. It will become a universal religion, laying, as he says, its great stress not on the believing in, but on the acting out, a religion not of the creed, but of the deed. It will fully accept the results of science, regardless of the beliefs or disbeliefs the scientific pursuit engenders. It need not even appeal to a personal God. Adler ended his address with a rousing vision of the future of religion. "Behold, in the dim distance I see it rise before me, the temple of the future, justice its foundation, peace and goodwill its columns, and the vast firmament of heaven itself its high dome. From all sides the nations gather, a mighty pilgrimage to its halls. On that day shall the genius of religion, which is the genius of Judaism, stand forth as the high priest of the people, and as the chorus of praise swells louder and louder amid the echoing voices of the enfranchised millions, again shall it proclaim its great humanitarian doctrine, its eternal watchword: one truth, one love, one hope in the highest, and one great brotherhood of men on earth. And all the nations there shall answer as with one accord, Amen, Amen." One truth, one love, one hope. I'm pretty sure those are the lyrics to a U2 song. So, as in many things, Felix Adler was ahead of his time in that too. In truth, for all the rhetorical bombast and youthful passion in Adler's address to Temple Emmanuel. Remember, he was only 22 years old, and he's daring to tell the members of one of the most significant Jewish congregations in the United States that they need to radically reform their religion. His vision of Judaism was genuinely startling and radical. Indeed, so radical was Adler's vision of Judaism that, in the words of ethical culture leader Arthur Dobrin, in essence, he reformed Judaism to a point that it was no longer Judaism. Because if you take away the idea of the Jews as a chosen people, if you discard the specific ritual practices of Judaism, if you allow science to do away with the idea of God, and if you open your doors to all humanity, then do you really have a form of Judaism anymore? That's a question that you are better placed to answer than I, and I hope that you will give your thoughts in the discussion, which will follow my presentation. So Adler didn't get the job as his father's replacement, but some of the members of his father's temple were so enthralled by his vision, and Adler couldn't let it go. He wanted a place where all people could come together to worship the good. He believed that religious differences between people about beliefs about the nature or existence of God, who was the best or final prophet, which texts encoded the divine will, put up walls between people which need not be erected. He saw at the heart of all the world's great religions an ethical core, a concern with right living. And he wanted to extract that core, which he thought of as the heart of religion, from all the dogma and ritual beliefs which surrounded it, and in his mind held it down. And so, with the support of a number of members of his father's congregation, Adler built something new. The first ethical society, the New York Society for Ethical Culture. This is the building that he went on to build, that they went on to build together. It's still there today. You can still visit it. You can still go to ethical society meetings. It's a gorgeous building, and I recommend you give it a look next time you're in New York. In his mind, ethical societies would not be dedicated toward the exploration and promotion of any particular religious creed. They would be dedicated toward the good itself. That's how Adler saw his goal. And in the address he gave at the founding of the first ethical society, years before this building was built, he lays out his thinking clearly. And I'm going to quote from Adler's founding address at a little bit of length here, because I think it's useful to get a sense of the direction of his thinking and a feel for his religious voice. So this is some of what he said when he announced the founding of the first ethical society. Candidly do I confess that it is my dearest object to exalt the present moment above the strife of contending sects and parties, and at once to occupy that common ground where we may all meet, believers and unbelievers, for purposes in themselves lofty and unquestioned by any. The freedom of thought is a sacred right of every individual, and diversity will continue to increase with the progress, refinement, and differentiation of the human intellect. But if difference be inevitable, nay, welcome in thought, there is a sphere in which unanimity and fellowship are above all things needful. Believe or disbelieve as ye list, we shall at all times respect every honest conviction. But be one with us where there is nothing to divide. In action, diversity in the creed, unanimity in the deed. This is that practical religion from which none dissents, This is that platform broad enough and solid enough to receive the worshipper and the infidel. This is that common ground where we may all grasp hands as brothers, united in humankind's common cause. The Hebrew prophet said of old, to serve Jehovah is to make your hearts pure and your hands clean from corruption, to help the suffering, to raise the oppressed. Jesus of Nazareth said that he came to comfort the weary and heavy laden. The philosopher affirms that the true service of religion is the unselfish service of the common weal. There is no difference among them all. Notice how Adler frames his enterprise here, and how it carries forward the ideas that he first expressed at his father's congregation. He specifically points to Christianity, Judaism, and the philosopher, which I take to be a reference to secular ethical philosophies, and says, let's stop arguing about the source of the moral law, because you all agree on the moral law itself. So why not come together and seek the good? In ethical societies, then, people would come together to develop our moral insight and to renew our moral energy without reference to the particular beliefs of any existing religion. If there's another life after this one, Adler thought, well, we can build an ethical society there. But here, in this place, we would examine how to be good now. No one would be excluded from joining the congregation because of their religious beliefs. It would be a universal congregation based on ethics alone, an ethical society. You can see, I think, how this is a humanistic idea before the time of contemporary organized humanism, really. A universal idea with the hope of bringing all people together to seek out the best in ourselves. And that universalist desire is represented in the structure and practices of ethical societies to this day. For instance, all kinds of religious ritual were removed from ethical society gatherings to make sure no one felt left out. Adler didn't want people feeling like ethical societies were too much like a Christian church because there was a Christian hymn, or too much like a synagogue because there was a menorah. He said, we propose to entirely exclude prayer and every form of ritual. Thus shall we avoid even the appearance of interfering with those to whom prayer and ritual as a mode of expressing religious sentiment are dear. And on the other hand, we shall be just to those who have ceased to regard them as satisfactory and dispensed with them in their own persons. So the way we hold our gatherings, the lack of candles or prayers or kneeling or hymns, all those trappings of traditional religions, is designed specifically to reflect our commitment to creating a congregation where anyone can attend and feel welcome. And that's true to this day in St. Louis, where I am clergy, and it's true to a similar extent in Wes and other ethical societies around the country. And that commitment to being a universal space where everybody can come together and no one feels left out meant that despite finding support from many people who were members of Temple Emmanuel, there was a removal of all Jewish ritual elements from ethical societies. And the early meetings at the New York Society for Ethical Culture became basically just a lecture and music. Classical music, of course, because Adler thought that was the most spiritually engaging and ennobling. And so the movement very quickly became dissociated from Judaism in the public mind. and was frequently during Adler's lifetime criticized as atheistic and amoral without any appreciation of its Jewish roots by more conservative religious critics. And over the years, the 140 plus years since the ethical movement has been going, it's lost any real connection with organized Judaism. In fact, today people are more likely to assume, if they think about our history at all, which most people don't, that we are an outgrowth of liberal Christianity rather than liberal Judaism. We're most commonly compared with Unitarian Universalism, which is an interesting comparison and perhaps one that we can dig into a little bit more in our discussion. And if you went to an ethical society meeting today, if you join us after this meeting, which you are all very welcome to do at the Ethical Society of St. Louis's platform, it's our Youth Sunday, so our young people are leading the program this morning, so it should be a lot of fun. No classical music though, I warn you. Then if you joined that meeting, it would be easy for you to conclude that there is nothing Jewish about us and no relationship to Judaism, historical or otherwise. And it's true that today the ethical movement is not a Jewish movement. It's not in self-identity Jewish, and our members do not all see themselves as Jewish, although many still do. And yet, and here is where I hope to lead into our discussion, I feel there are still some valuable connections which trace contemporary ethical humanism back to our Jewish roots. Indeed, I will confess that I do a huge amount of work with clergy of many different traditions all around St. Louis. And that means I attend a lot of religious worship services, which are nominally interfaith, but usually very Christian, honestly. And I speak as a representative of humanism and ethical culture. And I always feel more at home in Jewish congregations like yours, than I do even in liberal Christian ones. And before writing this address for you this morning, I wasn't exactly sure why that was, and I hadn't really given a lot of thought to it. But I think that it is probably due to the things that ethical humanism continues to carry from our Jewish roots because of our founder, Felix Adler, who was a Jew himself. The first thing that sticks out to me is that our tradition has always been fiercely committed to social justice and action in this life in order to better the state of humankind. The list of organizations which the American Ethical Union, which is the national organization of ethical societies, helped found is astonishing, and it includes the NAACP, the ACLU, the Visiting Nurse Service, the first free kindergarten in New York. Tons of important social institutions got their start in part with the help of leaders of ethical societies. And that commitment to improving the world in which we live as a religious ideal is very similar in my mind to the reform idea of tikkun olam. It's a very, very similar commitment to right action in this world as part of our religious commitment. Secondly, ethical humanism has been called by some a religion of relationships, because Adler's ethical philosophy was deeply relational. One of the reasons that he wanted to discard all the things he considered inessential about religion, but keep the heart, and considered the congregation to be something essential to religion and not one of the things that could be discarded, which some liberal thinkers of his day believed. They thought that religion was an internal personal pursuit that you do in solitary wandering in the woods and stuff, like many of the other transcendentalists whose works he read and which influenced him a lot. He wanted to keep the community aspect as a central component because he believed that human beings only become our best selves in community, that it was essential to be in relationship with each other in order that others might bring out the best in us and we might seek to bring out the best in them. I think that that commitment to community to relational life is also deeply Jewish and is reflected in the same commitment to community and relational life we see in Jewish congregations around the world today. And finally, and this is the idea I've struggled most with articulating in a clear way, so I hope you can help me in the discussion which follows. My sense is that ethical humanists have a different relationship to our own core religious values than most contemporary US Christians. And as a movement that started in the United States and now only exists in the United States, I'm focusing on the US context here. Obviously, Judaism exists all across the world. But my sense is that mainstream Christianity in the United States today, particularly in its most political manifestations, tends towards a certain dogmatism and a relationship to scripture and scriptural authority that ethical humanists just totally reject. Ours is a skeptical, discursive tradition. We are continually arguing with each other. We are continually revising our own ideas, making notes on our ancestors' platform addresses and disagreeing with them explicitly in our own. And I think that is quite Jewish too. That is a characteristic I have seen in many of the Jewish congregations I've had the privilege to visit, and many of the rabbis I've had the privilege to work alongside. They are discursive people. They're people who appreciate discussion and the development of ideas for their own sake. So three threads, three truths about contemporary ethical humanism, which I think stretch back to some degree to our Jewish ancestry, our commitment to social justice, our concern with community, and our willingness to argue with each other endlessly. But those are only my ideas. I, of course, come to this topic with a deeply personal perspective as someone who is not Jewish, although I have some Jewish ancestry, but who is deeply reverent for the tradition which I represent as clergy and for its history, and therefore fond of the Jewish history which is part of us. It's been my great privilege to tell the story of that history to you today, and I can't wait to engage in discussion with you about it now. Thank you very much.